Hello and welcome to Glitchy Switch, the podcast all about what it feels like discovering you have ADHD as an adult. My name is Martin and I believe that no one deserves to live in shame in a world not designed for them. So in each episode, I'll pick off the kind of questions that go through your mind on the journey from curiosity to diagnosis. Whether you're on your own journey or supporting someone who is, I hope my own experiences might just help you. I know what it's like to have a busy life and a busy mind, so each episode lasts about as long as a cup of coffee so you can easily fit it in and enjoy without draining too much energy. Right, first things first, thank you so much for coming along to listen to this, the first episode. We're going to begin at the beginning, which is a logical thing to do, isn't it? Which is when I first started to suspect that ADHD might just be part of my life, but I couldn't quite believe it. Now, we're going back to the early part of 2023, and I work from home a lot, so I'm locked away in my office for most of the day, but every now and again I emerge for a break. And usually when I do, to clear my head, I just bang on the radio. And this particular day was like any other. Stopped, thought, I'll go and have a cup of coffee, hit the radio on. And there was a lady talking on the radio about how she had had stress and anxiety for many, many years. And it had been misdiagnosed. And actually what she'd discovered was that she had ADHD. And listening to this lady talking, properly understood, and I'm assuming medicated, she just sounded so relieved and so much more happy. And I can't even really describe why, but it just stuck in my head. I was just listening to this lady because at that time I'd actually been pondering my own mental health. So I'd actually been on antidepressants for maybe 5 years or coming up 5 years at that particular point. And long story short, I'd been on them, and like many people will tell you, if you've been on antidepressants, once you get on them, even if you still end up getting stressed and anxious and having bouts of depression, you're kind of loath to come off them because this weird logic basically says, well, it'd only be worse if you didn't stay on them. But I had another sort of set of stressful episodes, and I thought, no, I clearly need to do something about this, probably some different meds. So all of this is sort of going on in my mind. I'd also been trying to address, if you like, the root causes of where that stress and anxiety was coming from. And I'd been reading quite deeply about sort of spirituality and self-help and all of that kind of stuff for maybe a couple of years. And added on top of that, I'd heard from sort of people close to me about the fact that they'd gone on to different medication, better medication, and it had been life-changing for them. So you might say there was a little bit of a context at this particular point, which is why my ears were particularly listening out for, I guess, insights and thoughts as to how I might deal with my own situation. In particular at that time, and I think this is why it was kind of fated that I heard this woman that day, I'd been reading quite deeply about self-acceptance, and I knew that self-acceptance was probably at the root of my inner turmoil to a great degree. So all of these things were going around my head like this heady cocktail, and then boom, this lady appeared. And so I listened and I thought about it, and I thought, well, it can't be ADHD, can it? I mean, that's naughty kids in classrooms. Surely I would have known about this now. And it made me sort of think that actually I was jumping to conclusions because really all I had was stereotypes about what ADHD was. And this lady alone was proof, if you like, that I may just have got that wrong. So anyway, I did what everybody does, go straight over to Google and Googled ADHD in adults. And of course, reams of different links came out. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I sort of sat there sort of mouth gaping open, and in particular on the NHS website here in the UK, I read off some of the typical traits of ADHD, and I was kind of open-mouthed just sort of reading it. It was incredible, really. And I just felt this amazing sense of recognition amongst all of these common traits. It's hard to describe. I know I made a commitment that I would talk about feelings on these episodes, but it really is difficult to put into words, just that sense of being seen. We all have this sense of an inner self, I think. So that part of ourselves that we really know inside, but actually we feel like we have to present something different to the outside world. And the gap between those two things for me anyway, had always been a source of sort of consternation, and what I've come to realise is now shame, because I knew that the world, and particularly the corporate world where I'd made my career, expected certain things, certain behaviours, expected people to look a particular way. And although I could do that, I knew that it took an awful lot of effort from me inside to show up like that. This was a cause of, I think, pretty well constant stress, and I could just feel in my mind the cogs whirring and thinking about, well, I wonder if actually I'm in the same boat as this lady on the call. I mean, just as a little bit of a benchmark, you might say, I would get up in the morning, most mornings for as long as I could remember, and the first thought that would go through my head was, oh God, I've got to do this again. And I've never been a morning person, and it's not just because I was a miserable so-and-so. It was generally because life just felt like hard work, and I never understood why. And then just reading about some of these traits, for the first time I started to feel, kind of legitimate, like I wasn't actually just a kind of bad person inside and it was something to feel bad about. Actually, there might be some reason or some valid explanation for the way I am inside. And when I looked at the traits, there were some that just struck a chord so much. So, for example, battling the impulse to interrupt people. I do that all the time, and I feel bad every time I do it. And I've worked on it, but I know it's a wrestle inside myself. The other thing is I'm very, very quick to emotion. And again, I've worked on it and I've learned to control it. But again, it's like a constant sort of fight inside. You know, you talk about people wearing their heart on their sleeve. I've always been very, very easy to wind up. I must have been, great fun to be around at school, for example, because you could wind me up so easily. I just had no filter at all. The other thing that I kept reading about in all of these articles was this idea of hyperfocus, this idea that you could sort of disappear down these rabbit holes if something got your interest. And that's so me. I mean, it was a really, really me thing to read. I've always been one of these people who, if I find something I'm into, I'll just go long on it until I think I've grasped everything that it's possible to reasonably grasp. I bore really, really easily, and I usually need multiple things going on at once. So it's not unusual for me to be like working with the radio on, or even when I'm preparing to do a DJ gig or something, I'll be listening to different music on my laptop and picking things out to play. But I'll have a podcast on in the background as well, and maybe the TV as well. I just can't seem to just have one thing going on. When I'm doing sort of desk work at work, so, those things where you sit there and you have to write a report or something like that, I don't just sit there and kind of churn it out. What I tend to do is work in a sort of sawtooth pattern. So I'll have like a real frenzy of work, and then I'll kind of stop for a bit, and then another real frenzy of work, and then I'll stop for a bit. And I always get things done. I pretty well always meet deadlines. I've never missed my commitments simply because I've been so maniacally focused on getting everything done. But I always thought that pattern of working was weird. I'm messy. I have terrible short-term memory. I can remember trivia, pop trivia. Anyone who knows me will tell you that. I can remember pop trivia from many, many years ago. But I couldn't tell you why I walked into a room. I couldn't tell you, watching a game show, who won the previous round literally 30 seconds later. And I know lots of people say, oh yeah, I do that all the time. But I'm literally doing that all day long. And it's such hard work just trying to stay on top of everything. The other thing that popped out was just general concentration, and particularly when reading things. So when I was at school, I always found really text-heavy subjects like history, and I studied classics, and classics came with a lot of learning of set texts and notes and things like that went with it. And although I did okay, I knew that was so difficult for me to understand, and I didn't know why, and I never ever felt that I could talk about it, because I guess sort of growing up in the 80s and 90s, saying that you found any element of reading or anything like that was just not really understood to the same degree, I think, that it is now. And I just sort of trained myself. Actually, I was a very, very good reader at school, but that was just through sheer effort and not wanting to be shown up for being deficient in some way. And still to this day, I find reading long documents very, very difficult. And I really can't learn anything by rote. I can't learn long things to regurgitate off the top of my head. I just find it freaks me right out. And the final thing, the real clincher in all of this, was there was this description of the brain being like a motor that won't stop. And that just blew my mind, because in my head, I've got this sort of mental image of me, and this is, bear with me, this is going to sound a bit weird, but me fueling a steam engine, shoveling coal into like the engine of a steam engine, and I'm shoveling away and shoveling away and shoveling away, and that's how my brain works. Like, it's like a train that won't stop, and I have to keep giving it fuel, which is why I keep having to stuff it full of things that I find interesting. So again, hearing people describe the way their brain worked as being like a motor or being like an engine they couldn't stop was just really quite profound, and that was the thing that made me think I was onto something. One thing though, and of course everybody knows that Google and the internet is kind of a dangerous thing. It's like anyone who goes to self-diagnose, you worry about sort of confirmation bias. So I was really sort of conscious of getting ahead of myself, but I just had this like gut feeling. It wasn't like any other sort of, I guess, ailment, for want of a better word, where you'd gone and Googled it and found it and thought, no, maybe not. Reading this and reading so many different sources, and then reading, one or two experiences from people, I just felt sort of seen in a way that in the preceding 45 years I'd never ever felt. And I just had this really, really strong gut feeling that I was onto something. And I've learned since talking to people that that's so common in people who are diagnosed with ADHD later in life. I was talking to a colleague of mine after I was diagnosed, and she was saying that her psychiatrist had said to her that in literally decades of working with ADHD people, whenever anybody came to them with such a strong gut feeling that they were probably an ADHD person, they'd never not yet had a situation where it wasn't borne out by a diagnosis. And I wasn't at all surprised. I was really, really worried about how others would react though. So I couldn't believe I had ADHD at first. I just didn't think it was relevant to me at all. And so on that basis, why would anyone else believe it? I was really worried that people would think I was jumping onto some kind of bandwagon, or trying to seek attention, or jumping to conclusions, or any of those kind of things. So I was already starting to feel a little bit defensive, you might say. I was almost anticipating all of the arguments I was going to have and bracing myself for having to defend my position, really, defend even the position of having suspicions. But I knew, deep down, I knew. And so I made the decision there and then. And the decision actually was the easiest one I think I've ever made, having said all of that. I was going to get diagnosed. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. You can get in touch via glitchyswitchpodcast@gmail.com with your thoughts and suggestions of things you'd like to hear about. You can also follow me on @glitchyswitchpodcast on Instagram for more on ADHD life and to find out what's coming next.